associate professor, at the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. Her research examines the effect of social influence on civic and political behavior, confidence in institutions, information evaluation, and public opinion formation. Katya's methodological expertise is in computation social science, network science, and survey research. She's the director of the Rutgers Computational Social Science Lab. I won't tell you more about Katya, but she has been working with some of us in the lab in the past. She's part of the standing committee on the science of science communication in the National Academy of Science, has interacted with teaching Schoffer out there in that regard, but we are really pleased to have her. Thanks for coming.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay to begin with? All right, thank you. So yes, thank you for the very kind introduction and for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be able to chat with you all and tell you a little bit about the research me and my colleagues are working on. I put the slides up on Dropbox just now in case you want to download them and follow along. Do not get scared. There's a billion slides. I will skip over most of them. So they're just in there in case something happens and I really feel like we need to mention a thing, but really we're not going to go over every single slide. I promise that. Okay. So as we already heard, the very kind introduction, I'm going to talk about misinformation and especially how it relates to three main factors, that is social networks, trust in democratic institutions, and technology and digital platforms. And the structure of this talk, you just heard the very, very brief introduction. We're going to talk first a little bit about trust and misinformation. My colleagues and I are working on a couple of book projects that deal with trust, and my piece of those book projects deals with the way that people process information and misinformation and what that has to do with trust in science and other institutions. So we'll do that. Then we'll talk a little bit about the role of social ties and social networks, which is something that you might have read if you glanced at the reading for today. It's a book chapter on that. And then we'll talk about digital platforms and digital tools, and we'll try to wrap up quickly enough to save a lot of time for questions. And if you want to reach out and chat with me after the colloquium, I am flying away pretty soon at the end of the day, but you can always shoot an email my way or schedule a Zoom meeting, and I'm excited to talk to people who are interested in those subject areas. So a lot of the data that we are going to talk about today comes from a few NSF-funded data collection projects. They include large-scale survey data collection. We are basically going in and collecting survey data from every state and Washington, D.C. We have been doing that since 2020, so for several years now, and we go in the field every few months and collect about 25,000 respondents per survey wave. That is combined with a collection of data from social media for some of the respondents in our surveys who give us their social media accounts. It's also combined with data collection from browser extensions that allow us to track our respondents' online behavior, again, for a subset of respondents that have allowed us to do that, which is pretty intrusive behavior, monitoring what they do online. But people who agree to do that, we are able to see that for them as well. So it's a really interesting large data set that comes from these couple of projects. One is called the COVID States Project. The second, the newer one, is called the Civic Health and Institutions Project. And the cool thing about this one, for those of you who are interested in staying in research, is that this project allows people to submit their own modules to be fielded in these large-scale surveys. So if you have a burning question that you want to get the answer to and compare that answer across all 50 states and Washington, D.C., you can submit a proposal, it gets reviewed, and then we add these for free in our surveys that we field, unless our NSF funding gets pulled, which, you know, always a possibility, but for now, we're doing this for another year. So if you're interested in submitting a survey module that just gets evaluated and distributed for free, we do that with this project. Okay, so one of the things that we've been really interested in tracking is trust in various types of institutions, right? So we have on the website of the CHIP 50 project, the Civic Health and Institutions Project, 50 states, we call it CHIP 50. for shorter. And on that website, you will see that we have a tracker that looks at the trust in a large set of institutions over the last 5 years. And we see some really, really interesting patterns. So I'll mention some of that today, and it has to do also with how we see people forming their attitudes and opinions about scientific information and misinformation. So trust in institutions, it's a big deal, right? Why do we care about trust in institutions and trust in science in particular? It's important for collective action. If you trust your institutions and something happens, if there's an emergency, then you can know where to look for information, know who to believe, and know what to do, right? If there's a pandemic and you don't trust any institutions, it's difficult to coordinate action together as a society, right? It reduces social complexity, trust does. It makes life easier because instead of monitoring your surroundings and the institutions around you, you can rely on them behaving in ways that are going to protect your interests. Trust is really interesting for us network scholars because it involves a lot of network heuristics. So people trust the institutions and others who are trusted by their social ties. And that's a really big and important thing to know that features into some of our discussion for a little later in today's talk. And then trust is linked to information and misinformation in really interesting ways. It's a complicated relationship. We know that how much you trust institutions is going to affect how you understand and process and believe the information that you get from them. But we also know, conversely, that you can consume information and misinformation that affects strongly how much you trust various social institutions, right? So when I talk about misinformation, I make a point usually of distinguishing between different things that go under that big header. When you read about misinformation, people sometimes mix up a variety of things that are involved in this process of being exposed to and believing and acting on misinformation. And so I want to just mention that there's different aspects like being exposed to misinformation, engaging with it, distributing it, believing it, behaving in certain ways based on that misinformation. And then there's the correction process, right? Correcting misinformation. And all of those are premised on exposure. So you have to be exposed to the misinformation for anything else to happen. But the other ones are kind of independent, right? You might be sharing the misinformation and not believing it. You might be acting on it and not distributing it. All kinds of things like that could be happening. And so I just want to point out that when I talk about misinformation today, what I'm mostly going to focus on is belief and behavior. So do people report believing statements that are false about science generally, but also other aspects of life? And then do people act on that in certain ways? Okay. So we know from past research that we've done, this is a study that we did using this browser data that checks where people get their information. We know that misinformation has a complicated relationship, as I said, with trust in institutions, right? So this is a paper where we looked at that relationship. We found that people who go online to websites that contain misinformation tend to change their levels of trust in mainstream media and in political actors. We also found that exposure predicts levels of trust in different ways depending on political ideology, right? So differential effects. And we also know that there's kind of mutual effects very often between trust and misinformation belief, and also with ideology and politics, right? But what we focus on today, the main kind of trust for the purpose of our conversation today in this group is going to be thinking about trust in science, right? Trust in science is really interesting because science is a somewhat amorphous thing that includes institutions, scientific institutions. It includes scientists and researchers like us who are doing stuff around science and with science. It includes a set of norms and processes for how we produce science, right? And so when we talk about trust in science, in this context, we generally kind of make the claim that trust in science is linked to this idea of trusting a specific way of producing knowledge, right? And trusting specific knowledge-producing institutions. So that's what we mean, that's what we focus on when we talk about trust in science. And in that sense, trust in science might compete with some alternative logics for how we explain reality around us, right? If we don't explain it by trusting what science tells us, we could be doing something like trusting intuition or trusting religion, or conspiratorial thinking might be the thing that's kind of guiding our beliefs. Or it could be even partisanship, right? We can rely on partisanship as one of the logics that kind of drives how we decide what we're going to believe in and how we're going to view the world, right? And we know that trust in science and misinformation beliefs are both quite strongly politicized, right? We know that trust in science is currently higher on the left, among Democrats, lower on the right, among Republicans, among conservatives. This was not always the case. 50 years ago, these roles were reversed. Republicans were the most trusting party. But over time, with the changes of stances of both parties in a number of ways, and also the changes of demographics that go into each party, right? The liberals became more urban, more educated. They drew on those people. The more rural people, the more religious people moved to the right. And so with these demographic movements, with the changes in elite rhetoric, the changes of how those parties talk about science, science became quite polarized as well, and trust in science. And so one question when we think about misinformation, which is already pretty polarized, and trust in science is, can trust in science tell us something about how people process and believe information beyond what we already can see or what we already know from politics, from ideology, right? Is there something over and above whether someone is liberal or conservative that will tell us something about belief misinformation if we include trust in science in that equation, right? So here are a few examples of what we've looked at in practice. For example, over time, over many years during the pandemic, where many equals 4, we've been tracking vaccine misinformation, vaccine misperceptions around COVID vaccines in particular, right? So things like COVID vaccines can cause infertility, right? And all kinds of other claims that have been made about vaccines that were not true according to our scientific consensus. And over time, one thing that we've seen is that there's a fairly stable group of people, about 20% of the population, that usually believe at least one of those misinformation claims. And then even more disturbingly, perhaps, there's a very stable group of about 40% of people who say they're not sure about at least one of those claims, right? They don't say outright, I believe this, but they say, I don't know if it's true or false, right? And we can see who those people are just descriptively. We can see that middle-aged people, older people are less likely to believe, hold misperceptions about vaccines. We can see how they break down by gender, by other things, race and ethnicity. One thing that's really interesting that I'll just highlight from those longitudinal charts is that people with higher education and higher income at the beginning of the pandemic were doing very poorly. They were believing a lot of false things, a lot of misinformation the first few months, because they were the ones who were seeking information, getting exposed to everything in the context of very high uncertainty before it was clear what was going on. But after the first few months, both higher education and higher income people suddenly drop in how much they believe misinformation, how much they hold these vaccine misperceptions, and they become the least affected category, right? So that's an interesting trend. And we also know that misperceptions about vaccines are linked to trust in science. We can see here, for example, that people who trust science a lot tend to be the people who don't have any misperceptions about vaccines and don't hold uncertainty about vaccines, whereas people who report having uncertain knowledge about vaccines or people who believe false things are the ones with lower trust, right? And so if you do this in terms of running a regression model that looks at either cross-sectional or longitudinal log data, you see that trust emerges as a really important predictor of holding vaccine misperceptions after controlling for all kinds of other stuff that include demographics, that include politics, that include geography, and all kinds of things like that. And so we see, for example, here that trust in the government and trust in science are negatively associated with holding these misperceptions about vaccines, whereas trust in Donald Trump and conspiratorial thinking are positively associated with this, right? Conspiratorial thinking is another key variable we use to make sure that we distinguish between having trust in science and then be where you are on this scale of being amenable to conspiratorial thinking, right? We see similar patterns over time of how trust and partisanship predict things, where trust is actually a better predictor in our models in many waves of data, including with lagged trust than partisanship. So is this only true about vaccines? Is this only happening with vaccines? Are there any other misperceptions that we can check this with? For example, one that's fairly prevalent is genetically modified foods, right? There's a lot of ideas about genetically modified foods that are not necessarily correct, including that there's harmful effects from GMOs that companies and the government are hiding. And when we look at harmful effects for GMO foods, we see again conspiratorial thinking pops up as very important after controlling for all these other things like demographics, partisanship, and so on. But trust in science is also a key factor that might be associated with lower belief in this particular set of misperceptions. And now, if trust in science is really not just about science, but it's about thinking of models of producing knowledge and basically having faith in some models of producing knowledge and not others, then trust in science might be predictive of things like political misperceptions, right? And so, for example, when we looked at predictors of believing that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, which is one of the big kind of misperception points that we have experienced in this society, we see that after controlling for the very strong effect of partisanship and ideology and things like that, and conspiracy thinking, we still see trust in science popping up as a significant predictor here as well. We see it for other things, like, for example, for claims like, hey, CIA agents confessed that government agencies were behind the 9/11 attacks, right? Again, conspiratorial thinking, huge impact, but beyond conspiratorial thinking and other factors, we still see trust in science emerging as something that seems to be associated with these beliefs. And so why do we care about this? What's the big deal, right? Why do we need to know that trust in science and misperceptions are linked? Why is that important to us? Well, because there's a number of outcomes that we care about in health, in politics, in civic life, in democratic life that this is going to have an impact on, right? So, for example, if we look at predictors of being vaccinated for COVID, we see that misinformation, misperceptions about vaccines are an important predictor. Uncertainty about vaccines, that is saying not that you believe misperceptions about them, but saying I'm not sure, also a predictor. And then trust in science, obviously an important predictor, right? And we see this pop up in cross-sectional data, in longitudinal data, in log data, in all kinds of things that I'm not going to show you in detail because I don't want to do this to you, but they are in the slides. It's not just about vaccines. It's related to other things that we see in the news that have to do with misperceptions about science and medicine. So, for instance, one of the false claims that we saw around media and social media during the pandemic was that there are certain drugs like ivermectin, which are originally taken as anti-parasitic drugs that people were saying could cure COVID, right, or could help with COVID. The FDA disagrees on that, and we actually looked at that and have a paper on it that says we found about 6% of people who got COVID at some point said that they had taken this drug, and this use of ivermectin for treating COVID was predicted by both misperceptions, misinformation, but also strongly by trust in science and trust in medicine, right? Even after controlling for partisanship and conspiratorial thinking and everything else that we thought might matter, right? So trust was important. Institutional trust played an important role in this particular outcome of whether people trust when the FDA and the CDC tell them not to take these medications off-label, that they're not going to help, or if people are going to actually go ahead and do that. Now, one interesting question that we've been asking is that you might be asking yourself as well is, why do people believe stuff that's not true, right? So when people tell us they believe something that's false, what is the reason? Is it that they don't know enough, right? They haven't read the news, they haven't seen enough information about it, they haven't heard scientists say that this is incorrect? Or is it that they've heard all of that, they've read the news, they've seen everything, and then they decided, made up their own mind to go a different way, right? To say that they don't believe what the news is telling them. We've been looking at how much information people have been exposed to over time, and especially in the early days of the pandemic, for example, people were following information and news about it pretty closely. That tapers off over time. People got more lax about staying on top of that. But we also see that the pattern of how people are connected to media and how much they trust science is also telling, in that the people who say they trust science a lot are also the people who tend to consume the most medical and health information and seek information about the pandemic, for example. And this is, again, something that it's difficult to pinpoint the causality. Is it that people who trust institutions go out and seek the information that those institutions have produced? Is it that people who read information are having their trust in institutions bolstered? Probably both of those in some kind of mutually causal way. But if we look at the predictors of news consumption about COVID, for example, we see that after controlling for a bunch of other stuff, trust in science is a key predictor there as well. But in order to understand a little better the initial question that we posed, which was the question of, do people say that they believe stuff that's wrong because they don't know any better, they haven't heard the correct explanation, or do they say it in spite of having heard what scientists tell them? We asked this question. We asked people to tell us whether they believe certain false vaccine statements. But also, we asked them afterwards, now, regardless of what you believe yourself, what do you think experts and scientists believe about these same statements, right? So initially, we asked them, what do you believe? Is this true, false, or you don't know? And then we ask now, what do you think scientists and experts believe about this? And interestingly, there's a notable gap between people saying that they believe false information, they hold misperceptions, and people saying that science is on the same side. Meaning that of the people who believe false information, of the people who believe false vaccine statements, about a third of them believe those even though they know that science disagrees with them, right? So a third of the people who tell us vaccines cause infertility would then go ahead and say, I know scientists and experts say otherwise, right? I know that the medical consensus is not on my side, and I still am going to tell you that's what I believe, right? So that's interesting. We also see that there is about 20% of the population, 20% of our respondents, who gave the following answers. They told us, I'm not sure what to believe here. I'm going to say, I'm not sure whether vaccines for COVID cause infertility. But when you ask me what science says and what experts says, I'm going to tell you, I know that they say it doesn't cause infertility, right? So 20% of our respondents said, we know science says this, and yet we're going to respond, not sure, when you ask me what I believe, right? So this is kind of goes along with this whole, you've probably heard it a lot in your classes, this idea of how science and science communication are going to respond to people's beliefs. So are we just going to broadcast information in people and think that that's enough for us to correct problems, to correct misperceptions, or is there something else that needs to happen, right? Interestingly, just one last fun tidbit is that people self-reported knowledge about vaccines was kind of inversely associated with their misperceptions. Meaning, when we asked people, how much do you know about vaccines, people who told us I'm an expert were the most likely to then believe something that's false about vaccines. And people like me who would answer the survey with, I know zip about vaccines, I know nothing, right? Those are the ones who actually did not have misperceptions, kind of. We have this Dunning-Kruger effect, or like we have this kind of idea in other places in science that maybe people are overconfident about disciplines that they know nothing about. And once you know a little bit about a subject matter, you realize how much you don't know, and you're less confident. So that's a fun one. That's a fun finding. Now, I'm a network scholar, and so originally I was trained as a network scholar, and so I think a lot about the role of social factors, social networks, social ties, the people around us in these processes, in how trust is built, in how our understanding of information happens. It all doesn't happen in our minds individually, it happens in a social, bigger social context, right? So that's an interesting thing to talk about as well. And we know that trust is kind of contagious in that if your friends, if the people around you, if your social environment, if your community trusts something, a person, an institution, right, then you're more likely to trust it as well, right? And so this is true for, this paper is particularly looking at this in the context of media trust, but it is true for trust in other institutions, and it's true of trust in individuals, right? And when we talk about misinformation, and this is the paper that the chapter that you read for today, we also know that misinformation is very, very much network dependent, in that people very rarely go and consume misinformation on their own, seeking it out and kind of identifying it on their own. What usually happens is that it spreads socially, right? Maybe you go on social media. Social media is a key vector for the spread of misperceptions, right? And we know that our exposure to information and misinformation, our decision to disseminate information or misinformation, our belief in information and misinformation, and even the correction of misinformation are all going to be strengthened when they're coming from social ties where social norms are in place and things like that. So if I see a piece of information that is shared by someone I trust or someone that I'm close to, I'm going to believe that much more than if it's just floating around and no one that I'm close to or no one that is in my social circles has confirmed it. Similarly with correction, we know that corrections are much more likely to be believed if they come from people in our social circles. If someone you know and trust tells you this is false, right? And so we also extended this to look a little bit at other types of social ties and social similarities. So this idea was that trust in science was going to be in some ways also linked to the social ties that people have to scientists and also to how they perceive themselves in relation to science. Right? So we would ask people questions like, well, do you know anyone who's a scientist or a researcher or a professor at a university, stuff like that, right? We would also ask people, let me see if I have the exact question. It's on the next slide, I think, maybe. Right, so do you think that people in the following profession are similar from you or different from you? And you have a bunch of professions, and some of those professions would be scientist and researcher and professor and whatever, right? And as you might imagine, the predictors of similarity to scientists include things like you're more likely to think that you're similar to people who do science if you're white, and if you're young, and if you're better educated, and if you live in urban areas and not in rural areas, right? Stuff like that. And so the other thing that's kind of important is that if you perceive yourself as being similar to scientists, you're more likely to trust science. right? So trust in science is predicted quite considerably. In fact, it was, I think, our best predictor in models that included a bunch of other stuff by feeling that you're similar to scientists, right? So that you're part of people who might enter this community. And so this is important because we have an amazing community of scientists in the US. They're fantastic. They're doing amazing work. They're incredible. But they're not very representative of the US population as a whole, right? They're more male, they're more white, they're more urban. They usually come from a better socioeconomic status than the general US population. And so our science community is not representing everyone, and we're seeing that people are less likely to trust the science community if they're not represented and don't feel like they can see themselves as someone who does science. And so we have a paper out right now that Jamie Druckmann from Rochester is leading that has done a bunch of experimental design kind of tests to see how those different factors affect people's opinion of scientists, and it's kind of pointing us in this direction. So we know that one of the reasons why we might be seeing people distrust science is when you break down trust into its various components. So trust includes things like, are these people competent? Right? But it also includes things like, are these people going to look after someone like me? Are they well-meaning? Are they benevolent? Right? Do they have my best interest in mind? Are they fair and just, and do they have integrity and stuff like that? So people are pretty high on, are scientists competent? They're like, yeah, scientists are pretty competent, but they're not quite as high on, are scientists, do they care about people like me? Are they benevolent? Do they have my best interest at heart? And so this is a really cool paper with the conjoint experiments that is hopefully going to come out soon that's going to talk more about this. So the last thing that I want to mention before we take some time to just chat and do questions and see what you all think about this is technology, right? So we've looked at the role of various digital platforms. We know that sources of information about various topics, we've been focusing a lot on COVID during the pandemic. So for example, sources of information about COVID. After TV, various types of television, and social contacts, so friends and family members, one of the huge sources of information about COVID was social media, right? Digital platforms. And especially Facebook is one of the most popular platforms that like 75% of Americans use, even though young people hate it. Facebook was one of the sources of information that close to a third of people who said that they were finding information about COVID told us that they go to, right? And in particular, we saw a group of people who had social media as their sole source of information. They weren't going to mainstream media, they weren't going to TV, they weren't going to other places, they were relying on social media in particular. And so one paper that we published about this specifically looked at as social media as this space where people who have low trust in science and in medicine and in institutions, people who hold misperceptions about vaccines and COVID, and people who don't trust mainstream media and don't get their news from like the CNNs and the New York Times and not even the Fox News places, that they use social media as a space where they can go and kind of communicate and exchange information. And so this paper is not to tell us that social media is causing people to be misinformed or to hold misinformation. That might be the case, but that's not the claim we're making. We're saying more that there's a group of people who, for whatever reason, are just not trusting institutions in society. Those are people who believe false claims about health. And those are people who, among other things, don't trust mainstream media sources. So they get information exclusively from social contacts and digital platforms, right? And for those people, social media is the space where they can go and exchange information. So this is interesting, among other reasons, because social media might be, digital platforms might be the only place where you can reach those people, right? You can't find them by blasting stuff on mainstream media. They don't watch mainstream media. They don't read newspapers. or they don't trust them when they do. And so technology is kind of a big deal. It's kind of an important thing when we think about the spread of information and misinformation, the way that our society structures itself in terms of who trusts science and who doesn't. We also looked at, in addition to social media, one other thing that a different team that I collaborate with has looked at is search engines. They're another really interesting and important place that people go for information of various kinds. And so one paper that we worked on for search engines was to check whether people who are strongly partisan, either strong liberals or strong conservatives, when they go to search engines, are more likely to see misinformation or biased information that agrees with their own views, right? Because one of the concerns that people have had is that social media and search engines and other algorithmic platforms are going to show people more of what they like, more of what they agree with, and that might include showing them false things, false stories, just because they're strong partisans in their side of the political spectrum believes those things, right? And what we found was interesting. We found that Google search, and this is another paper that uses the browser extension that tracks where people go for information, how they search, what search terms they use, and so on, and combines that with survey data. We found that the search engine wasn't showing people more biased information or more false information, even if they were strong partisans and even if they did believe false information. What was happening is that those people were more likely to, the search engines were showing about the same amount of false and biased information, but the people who were on the edges of political spectrum were more likely to click on it, right? So the search engine is still not blameless because it was showing some proportion of that problematic information, especially when people were using search terms that kind of prompted that specifically. But the major thing that was happening was that users were deciding to click more on the stuff that they liked, that agreed with them, even if it was false and biased. And so one interesting thing that is happening right now under this government is that we're seeing a lot of talk and a lot of discussions of platform regulation. And a lot of it is targeted towards more freedom of speech and less control, less moderation, less doing anything to prevent false information, even really harmful health-related misinformation from spreading. So when Elon Musk bought Twitter, and now X, he dismantled the team of people who were moderating the content on the platform in favor of a more open and freedom of speech kind of approach that left the platform full of information that would have previously been removed from it. We recently saw that Meta decided that they no longer needed fact-checking, right? This was after this current government administration took power. They just removed fact-checking and shifted to community nodes, right? So pulled back on moderation. One other space that's right now very important is large language models and artificial intelligence, right? So this is one other project that I'm leading along with a colleague of mine at Rutgers, the National AI Opinion Monitor, where we're just looking at how much people know about, how much they use, and what attitudes and opinions they hold about AI, and in particular, large language models, which are now a big deal. And they seem to be a new space where people are going to be getting information, right, a lot in the coming years. So it's very important what happens there. It's very important how scientific information is conveyed through these AI systems. And it's very important what people's attitudes are around that, right? And one thing that we find, if you go to the website for this project, there's a few reports that talk about trust in AI. So trust in AI is a big thing that we are going to try to track with this project longitudinally over time with a relatively large sample of respondents from a variety of demographic groups. And we see that there's a lot of trust in information produced by AI, right? Not as much as trust in media and journalists, but people don't trust media a lot, and so AI is not that much less trusted than media is, right? So there's quite a lot of trust, quite a high level of use of these systems like ChatGPT and Gemini and Microsoft Copilot and Claude and all of those. And there's quite a lot of trust. People also believe that they are able to recognize content that was produced by AI, which they can't generally, based on what we're seeing. And people also have, I don't think I included that particular chart here, but when you test objective knowledge about AI, the objective knowledge about AI is pretty low. And so what that means is that these systems are going to be a new space that's very important that people don't know a lot about, but have maybe more trust in than we'd like at this early stage. And at the same time, we see that this government is going against regulation for AI as well. So recently, they have made various steps that say that they would like to leave this market as unregulated as possible. They even went and chastised, our VP went and complained in the European Union about EU's excessive regulation of AI. And so what we're seeing now is a future that's coming up that's going to have pretty low regulation in terms of digital platforms and artificial intelligence. And pretty, perhaps, high stakes in terms of the misinformation, misperceptions that spread over these platforms. And so with that cheery note, I'm just going to wrap up here. I'm sorry, I should have come up with something more fun to end on, but this is where we're at. So this is my last thought, and with this, maybe we can do some questions or comments.